Stream marker. Hello and welcome to Philosophy Roulette number 226, where I read and review random pieces of philosophy research online for the viewing public. You can join me here on Twitch as the chat is and ask me questions as we go, or catch it later on the YouTubes. I just did another paper earlier. We are looking at the, this is the Inquiry Journal, an interdisciplinary journal of philosophy, and we read some another paper earlier, and now we've got this paper here. It's called Heidegger's Nietzsche, and I was like, you know what? I can do two papers from Inquiry because they're both available, and they're both not terribly long, so let's do it. You are always free to like leave a comment and whatnot. Under the, hey, where's my, wrong button. This one, that's the right button. Leave a comment on the YouTube later and ask questions. Yeah, and so we got, that's right. We're going to look at this. Alright, so this is by Taylor, Carman, Heidegger's Nietzsche, and I apologize for how I say everyone's names, get everyone's genders wrong and all that stuff, but like, this is my first time reading it, and so we'll just find out what happens. Heidegger is well known, for some notorious, for insisting that Nietzsche was, as he put it, a metaphysical thinker. What did he mean by that? What was metaphysics for Heidegger, and in what sense did Nietzsche's thought, for better or worse, exemplify it? The answers to these questions are not obvious, in part because Heidegger's own conception and assessment of metaphysics was changing dramatically between 1939 and 1940, just when he was delivering the Nietzsche lectures in Freiburg. Heidegger always described Nietzsche as a great metaphysical thinker, but what that meant differed depending on when he said it. So, for example, in his 1935 lectures, later published as Introduction to Metaphysics, the word is, for him, a generic synonym for philosophy, from the pre-Socratics to the present. Metaphysics is the name of the definitive center and core of all philosophy. By the end of the decade, it referred pejoratively to a tradition and a tendency of thought that, he would now say, began with Plato and ended with Nietzsche. Heidegger's claim that Nietzsche was the last great metaphysical thinker of Western philosophy thus began as high praise, but soon became instead, in his later vocabulary, a diagnosis and a critique, one that became even more insistent in later lectures and essays, especially Nietzsche's saying, God is dead, and who is Nietzsche's Zarathustra. In the second volume of her Life of the Mind, Hannah Arendt suggests that Heidegger's turn from the analytic of Dasein and being in time to the later writings of the 1940s and 50s occurred as a concrete autobiographical event precisely between Volume 1 and Volume 2 of his Nietzsche, a collection of texts published in 1961, but mostly consisting of lectures delivered in the late 30s. Arendt writes, to put it bluntly, the first volume explicates Nietzsche by going along with him, while the second is written in a subdued but unmistakable polemic tone. As it happens, precisely between the two volumes coincides with the outbreak of war in the autumn of 1939, and although Germany's invasion of Poland was surely not the single decisive factor, it is clear that Heidegger's view of Nietzsche dimmed at around the same time he was becoming disillusioned with the official National Socialism. Clear evidence of his growing disenchantment with the regime can be found in the recently published and translated Ponderings 2 through 6, Black Notebooks 1931-38, and the History of Being of 1938 to 1940. In the latter, for example, he condemns the metaphysics of power and machination as metaphysics of devastation, which he describes as the undermining of every possibility of any decision and of all domains of decision. Arendt's observation of exchange of tone in Heidegger's reading of Nietzsche in 1939 is not wrong, but it is potentially misleading, for it was not primarily his assessment of the style or the substance of Nietzsche's thought that had changed. Throughout the lectures, Heidegger portrays Nietzsche as a profound thinker whose concept of will to power and eternal recurrence articulate the meaning of being as it is tacitly but effectively understood in modern culture. In spite of the change of tone, that is, there is a considerable continuity in the story Heidegger tells, both before and after the war, about what Nietzsche thought and where that thought positioned him in the history of Western philosophy. Heidegger's treatment of Nietzsche, it must be said, is hardly convincing as scholarship. Indeed, Heidegger always insisted that his hermeneutical engagements with thinkers of the past were not scholarship, but creative critical encounters intended to yield new ideas, not more correct or complete presentations of old ones. As such, like Nietzsche's own broad critical forays, as he calls them in Twilight of the Idols, into moral and philosophical tradition, Heidegger's approach, I want to suggest, reveals something genuine and important in the style or tendency characteristic of Nietzsche's way of thinking. It is that character or manner of thought that Heidegger has in mind when he insists that Nietzsche was a metaphysical thinker. Okay, so what we've got going on here is a bit of like historical analysis of what happened while Heidegger was talking about Nietzsche. It was a bit of a tumultuous time. I mean, I don't know how... I mean, there's a lot of evidence that Heidegger never really stopped being a Nazi. But, again, he did get disillusioned with the Nazi party at a time. Like, he pulled back a bit. So, it's kind of hard to know exactly what was going on in Heidegger's head at these times. I mean, we only have his writings and like these sort of things. But yeah, so at that time he was talking about Nietzsche, and the question is, how do we interpret changes in that stuff given the things that were going on in the world and what we know about Heidegger and his philosophy and his opinions. Okay, so I'll try to figure this out. What Heidegger did not mean. It is worth making clear at the outset what Heidegger did not mean by that claim, both in its laudatory sense and then with the critical diagnostic import it came to acquire. First, Heidegger did not mean that Nietzsche was the inventor of ingenious metaphysical doctrines. The definition of metaphysics as a kind of science in the broad sense of the German word Wissenschaft rests on the conceit that its aim and purpose is to generate substantive doctrinal content. Following Kant and pointedly rejecting Husserl's conception of phenomenology as supposedly rigorous science, Heidegger denied that philosophy is or can be anything like a science. Nietzsche was a great thinker, but not because he was in the business of advancing theories purporting to describe the world in a dispassionate, objective way. Yeah, I mean, I don't think I read his Nietzsche lectures. I've probably looked at them a few times, but yeah, I don't think anyone was accusing Nietzsche of like constructing interesting arguments. He did construct interesting arguments, but I don't think that's what Heidegger's interest in Nietzsche was. Not like for technical ingenuity and like metaphysical stuff. More generally, Heidegger never understood great thinkers as wholly original or autonomous sources of their own insights. Instead, he saw them as observers or witnesses receptive to something that was happening in the culture around them. Their achievement was not innovation or ingenuity, but vision. So, for example, Plato did not simply concoct the theory of forms as the solution to a problem. Rather, he articulated a new understanding of knowledge whose ideal was not the occult revelation of subterranean mystery, but the maximally correct theoretical representation comparable to the way in which Thucydides set aside legend and storytelling in favor of the documentation of objective historical fact. Likewise, although he makes frequent reference to what he takes to be Nietzsche's principal doctrine, will to power and eternal recurrence, Heidegger uses the word doctrine as a kind of neutral placeholder. These two ideas were central in Nietzsche's thought, Heidegger maintains, not as original, let alone plausible or promising theories, but as oblique expressions of the modern technological understanding of being. Okay, so this doctrine is more of the modern way. And you could call it like a way, the technological understanding being the way we are now. So this is sort of like a general way of describing the contemporary situation. So modern technological understanding of being the way we are now. So there's the doctrine of the way we are. All right. Second, a fortiori, in saying that Nietzsche was a metaphysical thinker, Heidegger did not mean that he espoused flawed theories that could either be perfected by means of greater philosophical refinement or refuted by overcoming metaphysics altogether, as by the late 1930s Heidegger claimed to be doing. He was in part, no doubt, strategically stealing Nietzsche's and Carnap's. Everyone likes to steal from Carnap. It is one of the problems in 20th century philosophy. It's like, did you steal this from Carnap? And did Carnap steal this from Wittgenstein? Nice. I like anything related to our understanding of technological senses. Yeah, this is why I want to read this paper after the previous one, which was on like the individuation of words. This is sort of like completely different sort of philosophy, is trying to understand the modern technological world we live in versus this sort of historical appreciation of like where words come from. Very different sort of philosophy. Yeah. Okay. So he was in part, no doubt, strategically stealing Nietzsche's and Carnap's anti-metaphysical thunder, but he never criticized Nietzsche merely by trying to refute him. Indeed, as we shall see, it was precisely Nietzsche's tacit commitment to what Heidegger calls the metaphysical concept of truth, namely truth as correctness, that marks Nietzsche as still belonging to the tradition that Heidegger took himself to be overturning. Yeah, so let's just highlight this real fast. Truth as correctness. It's trying to like get something right about the way the world is. Like say it correctly. Third, also a fortiori, Heidegger did not embrace the text posthumously, published under the title Will to Power as Nietzsche's magnum opus, hence as the authoritative source containing Nietzsche's core metaphysical doctrines. On the contrary, near the beginning of the 1939 lecture course, in a section entitled Nietzsche's so-called major work, Heidegger insists that the Will to Power as is published is not a work of Nietzsche's at all. It contains only what Nietzsche wrote down, but the ordering and structure of the book are, as he says, spurious. Heidegger does admittedly help himself to the material included in the book, which, though a merely arbitrary sampling of the Nachlass, nevertheless provides a clue to Nietzsche's way of thinking. But again, it was not that way of thinking, not the theoretical content of his putative doctrines, that Heidegger took to be the substance of Nietzsche's philosophical achievement. Yeah, this is probably referring back to Nietzsche's sister edited a lot of his stuff and like moved things around. So perhaps Heidegger was going back to the point that like Nietzsche didn't always like some of the stuff that Nietzsche wrote was put together not in the best way or not in the original way. So we don't actually know exactly what Nietzsche had written. We only kind of have a like a summarized, rearranged version, and that's just a historical fact. Finally, in saying that Nietzsche thought metaphysically, Heidegger did not mean, as readers sometimes suppose, that his thought was somehow confined to entities. I can't read German, I'm sorry. To entities and fail to grasp being, the Das Sein. The positive sciences study entities, each within its own antecedently demarcated ontological region, but Heidegger never simply equated metaphysics with the positive sciences. Notwithstanding the evolution of his views, both of metaphysics generally and of Nietzsche in particular, one guiding thread remains constant throughout the Freiburg lectures from 1936 to 1940, namely that what made Nietzsche's thinking metaphysical was his attempt to think entities as such and as a whole, which is to say, entities in their being, which is, finally to say, the meaning of being, what it means to be. Prior to 1936, Heidegger had maintained that the effort to think the meaning of being was the very definition of Western philosophy, from Heraclitus and Parmenides to his own fundamental ontology in being and time. Thereafter, he came to regard it as an impossible conceit, a radical orientation of thought that was at once a symptom and a source of the forgetting of a more ancient yet abiding attunement of thought. That other being of thinking, Heidegger said, is neither representation or calculation, but a kind of meditation or reflection. On what? Not the being of entities, but being as such. Not the meaning, but what he now called the truth, or unconcealment of being. Yeah, so what's being said up here is that Nietzsche, for all his work, was still sort of trying to overcome a system he was in. And Heidegger is saying, look, that sort of ended that because they were still talking about being and understanding the correct way to be. And if you're you're like the will to power, you're still within that will to power of the way of that being. It's still within the sort of like the old framework. Heidegger is trying to get out of that. He was trying to say, look, we're not going to be that way. We're going to try to like sort of meditate in the world and like sort of, was like the dwelling of the existence and sort of dwell in the unconcealment. Try to like be in a place and in that way have the being unconcealed, which is a different sort of thing. At least that's my terrible gloss of it. The hinge on which Heidegger's reading of Nietzsche turns can thus be summed up in two claims. First, like all great metaphysical thinkers from Plato and Aristotle to Hegel and Schelling, Nietzsche thought the meaning of being, which is to say the totality of entities as such, that is, in their being. Second, however, and precisely for that reason, like his predecessors, from classical Athens to the classical philosophy of Kant and German idealism, Nietzsche fell prey to a forgetting, an oblivion, indeed a blindness to the truth of being, in contrast to what he supposed was the meaning of being, namely will to power and eternal recurrence. Okay, yeah. And so this is better than what I said, of course. But the meaning of being is this will to power and eternal recurrence, but that actually is just coming back to the totality of entities as such. And so since you're referring from here back to here, then you're not actually getting back, you're not actually overcoming the system, because you're still looking at the metaphysics of the way the world, your received world. So. Okay. So, now, of course, a Nietzschean might fight with Heidegger on this and say, no, this is not what was happening in Nietzsche. Nietzsche did overcome. And that this is a misreading of what happened in Nietzsche. And so, he's not, once he got to the totality of entities, maybe he overcame them. And so, it is not the totality of entities anymore. Perhaps Nietzsche got out of it. I don't think he did, but maybe a Nietzschean would say this is how you get out, is that once you get to the totality, you somehow then overcome. And so you can only do that via the will to power and eternal recurrence. But I mean, perhaps that's just reiterating Heidegger's point that Nietzsche was still in the old way, and maybe there was a way out, but it wasn't clear. I mean, I'm not a Nietzschean, I can't really defend him. But yeah, so it's like, but in some sense, the Hadagarian point is that if you're going to start off in this area, it's hard to get out of it, and that's where the blindness comes in. Like once you sort of like start, drinking the Platonic poison, you're never gonna like get out of it. Okay. Drinking the Kool-Aid, as it were. It wasn't even Kool-Aid back in the day. It was what was the other stuff? I forget. Anywho, continuing. And feel free to ask questions to Marshall, anyone else out there. Let me know. Eternal recurrence as authenticity. Heidegger's reading of past philosophers often have a kind of Jekyll and Hyde quality, alternating between sympathetic interpretations on the one hand, in which he sees his own ideas anticipated, especially by Aristotle and Kant, and critical encounters on the other, in which he distinguishes himself sharply, at times dismissively, from his predecessors. Thus it was, as Arendt observed, in his interpretations of Nietzsche. The shift in Heidegger's approach emerges with particular clarity in the two very different interpretations he advances of the idea of eternal recurrence. The first reading can be found in his lectures of the summer semester of 1937. The second, more critical, indeed hostile reading appears in the summer of the semester of 1939 in an undelivered lecture that Heidegger wrote that same year in a 1940 text entitled Nietzsche's Metaphysics, and finally in the 1953 Who is Nietzsche's Zarathustra? Consider the two readings in turn. De Marshall says, I know Nietzsche hated Plato and he tried to turn Plato metaphysics, but I forget how and why. Yeah, well, Nietzsche basically saw the history of Western philosophy from Plato on onward as a thing that once you looked at it, you could say he tried to look at the whole thing and say, look, this is like some of the problems with it, and he tried to get out of it. It was basically saying, look, we're going to turn the way they made the world in this sense. We're going to try to become a new man in some sense. I know Heidegger is all about being, so a radical approach to it. Yes, the very radical sort of, Heidegger is very Aristotelian, to be fair, and Nietzsche was more Platonic, so this may just be the old fight reiterated. But, yeah, if you're looking at the history of Western philosophy, it goes back and sort of like there's a track that you can look through that everyone's sort of looking at sort of the history of philosophy and going that way. So, And Nietzsche was just like, no, we're going to do something different now. But the way he was going to overturn everything, he was going to flip everything around. But he was still using the old ideas, and he was just like flipping it around. So let's see what's going on here. It's very hard to pull up the old philosophy when I'm doing this, actually. Okay, continuing. Recall that in the section of the part 3 of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, entitled On the Vision and the Riddle, the dwarf, whom Zarathustra also calls the spirit, just the ethics, that's right, of whom Zarathustra also calls the spirit of gravity, my devil and archenemy, mocks Zarathustra by telling him, you have thrown yourself thus high, but every stone that is thrown must fall. The remark is a rebuke and a warning, but is couched in an image of justice familiar from antiquity, namely balance, equivalence, proportion. What goes up comes down. The parabolic trajectory of a projectile is symmetrical. In the second numbered portion of the text, Zarathustra confronts the dwarf with his abysmal thought of eternal recurrence, which he pictures as two eternities meeting at the gateway inscribed with the word moment. The dwarf reacts to this image disdainfully by muttering, everything straight lies. All truth is crooked, time itself is a circle. Zarathustra's angry response is telling. Spirit of gravity, he says, do not treat this so lightly. What is going on here? The circularity of time is usually understood to be essential to the idea of eternal recurrence. So why does Zarathustra reject the dwarf's assertion? Indeed, why angrily? In his 1939 lectures, Heidegger argues that Nietzsche's favored image of time in this presentation of the idea of eternal recurrence is not that of a smooth and continuous circle in which past and future are identical, and every moment hence no moment at all is a privileged now. Instead, the image he presents to the dwarf is that of a unique gateway called moment, lying, quite literally, smack in the middle of two eternities, not one. The two eternities, that is, are not merely distinct. Zarathustra insists that they they abut on one another. Hollingdale translates. Yeah, so the two eternities, so we've got eternal recurrence, but like there's two of them. So there's multiple ones. Then they just sort of like line up. So you get into them, but like they're not the same. You're just in between two eternities that sort of recur. So that's interesting. So and you're somehow in between, you're stuck in between two eternities, and that's what the eternal recurrence is. It's not that you're coming back on the same one, it's that you're always stuck in between two of them. Okay. That twofold idea, namely that the past and present are distinct, not identical, and that they do not just meet but collide in the present, recurs in part 3 in the section entitled The Convalescent. Here again, Zarathustra, who calls himself advocate of the circle, chastises his animals as buffoons and barrel organs for expressing what might appear to be his own idea. Everything goes, everything returns. The wheel of existence rolls forever. Everything departs, everything meets again. The ring of existence is true to itself forever. The animals are not factually incorrect, one might say. Rather, it is the glibness of their hymn in praise of eternal return, Zarathustra complains, that has made a hurdy-gurdy song of what he experienced as a horrifying, abysmal vision. The difference between what the dwarf and the animal say and what Zarathustra meant to convey could just be a matter of tone and effect. But why does Zarathustra begin his account by pointing to the gateway called moment between past and future, two paths leading endlessly in different directions? One might suppose that image of a privileged present between two seemingly linear eternities on either side is just an initial impression, a naive preconception of time that the circularity of eternal recurrence is meant to subvert. This would render Zarathustra's emphasis on the present moment an inadequate, finite representation of the infinity of time, properly conceived as an undifferentiated and unending cycle. Alright, so basically we've got this version of the eternal recurrence. It's not that you're in the same loop. It's that you can go to the history or you can go to the future, but they're the same thing, but you're stuck in between these two sort of very similar, well, they're not the same, but you're stuck in like a recurring history and future that never, you can never sort of like be different about. So that's why it's an eternal recurrence. No matter where you go, you sort of end up in the same, in between the history and the future. So, yeah. Heidegger's 1937 reading of Zarathustra pushes against those temptations to dismiss or minimize Nietzsche's emphasis on the finite, situated temporality of human experience in favor of the cosmic infinitude of eternal recurrence. Nietzsche uses the idiomatic expression, more German, which means affront or offend, as Kaufmann has it, but more literally refers to a butting of heads, a collision. Heidegger seizes on the more literal reading, glossing it as a reference to a genuine irreducible collision of past and future. Far from minimizing the situated standpoint of finite agents, Nietzsche sees precisely in it the true meaning of eternal recurrence. On Heidegger's close reading of Zarathustra's initial articulation of the idea of eternal recurrence, that is, the eternity of eternal recurrence, lies not in the unboundedness of a circle in which past and future are continuous and identical, but rather, as Nietzsche says in an unpublished note from 1887, the momentary seductive flash of gold on the belly of the serpent Vita. The present moment is the glance of the eye, the very word Heidegger uses in Being and Time to describe the moment of decision, of choice, of action. Okay, so we've got this like sliver of like gold, a glance of the eye, right in between the history and future, which are sort of like that's the eternity we can't really enter, but we've got this like in between, a seductive flash of gold. So, just on the belly in between of everything else. So, okay. Tying the idea of eternal recurrence to the finitude of practical decision in this way allows Heidegger to assimilate Nietzsche's dramatic presentation of the idea of the concept of authenticity he had elaborated a decade earlier in Being and Time, more particularly his account of the temporal structure of forerunning resoluteness. In plain language, the experience of seizing the moment and leaping wholeheartedly into the possibilities that define one's future, including one's death. That experience, Heidegger had argued, reveals a temporal structure that constitutes our understanding of selfhood. In human temporality, unlike objectively measurable succession, which has dominated traditional philosophical conceptions of time, the future is basic, and it is our projection into possibilities that allow us to reclaim the past in such a way as to define our present situation. That future temporality of finite selfhood, Heidegger maintained, was the key to what, in the 1920s and early 30s, he was perfectly happy to call the metaphysics of human existence. Yes, I did see that the tournament was, congratulations to Zane and thank you, and I appreciate the gift you sent over. So that was cool. I mean, I guess that was Zane's choice, but so I gotta thank Zane and I thank you. For those who don't know, there was a Minesweeper tournament held on Bubba Bloop's channel. So, like, give Bubba Bloop a little shout out. Boom. So, check out Bubba Bloop. He's probably going to be streaming later tonight. Yeah, I think you're streaming later tonight. And we got Minesweeper tournaments coming up now, which is cool. So, there's like Minesweeper Battle Royale happening and stuff. Don't tell Zane, but I was going to gift him a sub on Java anyway. Yeah, that's nice of you. I won't tell him. Maybe he's here. I don't know. Tournament Zane won. Yep. It was good times. It was good times. A little late at night. I started like losing my mind at like the end, but I tried to help out. Yeah. So. Okay. So instead of this eternal recurrence, which Minesweeper is very good at because it's the same game over and over but different every time, but you're always doing the same thing. It's the flash of brilliance that lets you solve the puzzle. That is what is really the lesson is going on here. That was what Heidegger says Nietzsche's real brilliant insight was. It's that even though every game in the past is going to be just like every game in the future of Minesweeper, it is the little bit of gold in solving that one puzzle right there, that moment of decision. That is where you live. Sorry if I'm entertaining myself. I just find that funny. Alright, we're like past the halfway point here. So if you guys have questions, cool, but we're trying to figure out what is going on with Heidegger's interpretation of Nietzsche. Thank you. Practice my speechifying. Heidegger did not often enlist Nietzsche as an ally or a precursor to his own philosophical efforts. Indeed, he had abandoned that sympathetic attitude almost entirely by 1939 in favor of a far more critical approach. The lectures of the summer semester of 1939 begin under the section heading Nietzsche as Thinker of Consummation of Metaphysics. The consummation of metaphysics. And Heidegger repeats the claim in the lecture he wrote in that year, but did not deliver owing to the outbreak of the war. Its title is The Eternal Recurrence of the Same and the Will to Power, and it appears, as Arendt would remind us, at the very beginning of Volume 2 of the German edition, midway through the third volume of the English translation. The claim seems consistent with the laudatory tone he had taken earlier, but in fact it says something new and different, something unprecedented in the previous lectures. For Heidegger, Nietzsche is no longer merely one of the great philosophers of the tradition. Instead, his thinking marks the completion, the fulfillment, the end of metaphysics. That is, he did not merely think the meaning of being as deeply or as decisively as past philosophers had done. He thought it differently and had ultimately pursued it to the dead end that metaphysical thinking is and always was ever since Plato's valorization of the theoretical reason and the allegory of the cave. So, you see though, this is the completion, fulfillment, the dead end of metaphysics, I guess he would say. So it's the end of metaphysics, but it's a dead end here. I don't know, maybe I said that earlier. It was a Freudian slip. Okay. Consequently, Heidegger now says Nietzsche was no less trapped than his philosophical predecessors in the systematic forgetting of being. All great thinkers, not excluding the metaphysical thinkers of the tradition, think the meaning of being as it prevails in their own age. Thus, Nietzsche thinks the meaning of being not as it prevailed in antiquity, in the Middle Ages, or in early modernity, but as it has emerged in the understanding that holds sway in the late modern technological culture. Nietzsche thinks entities as such and as a whole, Heidegger says, as constituted by an unleashing of power into its essence, namely as will to power. Will to power is not will for the sake of power, but will purely for the sake of the enhancement and proliferation of further will, power being merely the name for that enhancement and proliferation. But to what end? Why? For the sake of what? About that, Nietzsche has nothing to say. Hence, this unleashing of power to its essence is Nietzsche. What this unleashing of power to its essence is, Nietzsche is unable to think, nor can any metaphysics think it, inasmuch as metaphysics cannot put the matter into question. Nietzsche's thought is that the consummation of metaphysics, according to Heidegger, because it is the completion and perfection of nihilism. Yeah, so Heidegger's basically claiming Nietzsche was a process guy. He was looking at this process of always just sort of like building further will to, for the enhancement and proliferation of more will. And that's what he called power. But it's just this sort of like recurring enhancement and proliferation. It didn't have any point. But like that's sort of why it's just the end, because it's not nihilistic. It just acts for itself. It has no great purpose. And so this sort of mental or philosophical just enhancement and reiteration of itself is not going anywhere in Heidegger's understanding. But he says that's what Nietzsche did by taking the full history of Western metaphysics and just looking at it building on itself. His analysis of it just building on itself showed that it just sort of didn't go anywhere because it was only just building on itself and didn't have any meaning to it, and so was nihilistic. So that's harsh. Heidegger was not like nice. Like, I don't think of him as like a nice philosopher. Like, I really don't. Like, Heidegger was not like, if you want to talk about like people being nice to like other like philosophers or like giving nice criticisms, that's not what was going on in 20th century philosophy. Far from anticipating the existential Augenblick, the moment of authentic decision in being and time, Nietzsche's idea of eternal recurrence, Heidegger now maintains, thinks the constant permanentizing of the becoming of whatever becomes into the only kind of presence there is, the self-recapitulation of the identical. Yeah, so it's spinning its wheels, basically. Just self-recapitulation of itself. It's spinning a wheel. Consequently, Nietzsche's doctrine does not, he really want a purpose. Well, not a purpose for the will to power. It's saying that the will to power doesn't have a purpose. And so he doesn't want one. He's saying that Nietzsche's conception couldn't have one. And so for that matter, it failed as a good theory because it was spinning its own wheels. So not that he wanted a purpose for the will to power, he says that the concept of will to power is flawed. Yeah, self-recapitulation of the identical. Consequently, Nietzsche's doctrine does not overcome metaphysics. It is the uttermost unseeing adoption of the very guiding projection of metaphysics. Nietzsche sought to overturn metaphysics, but he merely inverted it, and as Heidegger would later complain of Sartre's existential slogan, existence precedes essence, the reversal of a metaphysical statement remains a metaphysical statement. Nietzsche's philosophy is an inverted Platonism, moreover one that becomes blindly inflexible and superficial. Alright, and so you don't have to, of course, take Heidegger's word for it, but that's kind of what he was saying, I think. I mean, I don't know the history, of course, so I can't argue with the author's interpretation here, but I think this is at least generally my understanding of kind of like Heidegger's position on this stuff. In section 4 of the 1940 Nietzsche's Metaphysics, Heidegger likewise finds in eternal recurrence an expression of the nihilism inherent in the metaphysical thinking. According to Nietzsche, the total value of the world cannot be evaluated. Hence, becoming, which is to say, Heidegger adds, all that is, as a whole, has no value at all. Valuelessness, meaninglessness, aimlessness, Nietzsche says, is a fundamental article of faith for a nihilist like himself. Yeah. Moreover, Western culture is itself nihilistic. That is, meaninglessness is the way in which the totality of entities comes to presence. The metaphysical expression for this is the eternal return of the same. But Nietzsche also collapses the distinction between being and becoming by seeing their identity as a singular effect or expression of will to power. To stamp becoming with the character of being, that is, the supreme will to power. In this way, Nietzsche, in effect, projects and enjoins the truth of entities in the direction taken by metaphysics. How? By articulating both the what, essentia, and the that, existentia, of entities as such and as a whole. What everything is will to power. That anything at all is for it to recur eternally. Yeah, so the what is that is this thing, and that what it does is it just spins. You're stuck in this like past and future, and that's the eternal return. You're never in the history or in the future. You're always stuck in the middle of it, kind of spinning your wheel, according to Heidegger. Okay, let's get a little tired at this point, going for almost 2 hours, but hey, ask questions and I will still try to answer. What is nihilistic in Nietzsche's articulation of the meaning of being in both its what and its that character is the erasure of the phenomenon of truth, precisely for the sake of maintaining the concept of truth as correctness. For the permanentizing of becoming must of course be a falsification. What do I think of Nietzsche? I'll tell you in a sec. Becoming is precisely not being understood as permanence. No proposition can ever, as it were, catch entities and hold them fast, and so be true of them. Truth is error. So this is the Carman, of course. There's some things in Nietzsche I like, but overall I'm actually with Heidegger on this. I don't think Nietzsche got out of the old theories. I think he in some sense did do a good job like capping them. I can't speak to like all of the Hadagarian interpretation of this, but yeah, for the most part, I like some of Nietzsche's analysis. I do not generally hold Nietzschean views, although some of my views are pretty close. I've been told at least. But yeah, Nietzsche is interesting, and some of it is like extremely contemporary, but generally I find him a little bit in trying to like get out, it's like, you're trying too hard, and it's like you're trying to get away from the history of philosophy. In doing that, you sort of like you step on your own feet, you catch your own tail. So I am sort of with this view that he didn't quite, in being a little too historically minded, he ended up hampering himself. Technically saying, I think he never really understood the some of his technical like debts in some sense, like his historical debts, that he still was using a lot of like he didn't really understand the logic of a lot of what he was doing, and so like the late 19th century and early 20th century logic really sort of changed the way we look at the world. Like, I'll be honest, I don't remember much of Nietzsche at all, but I do know I got the idea of having an ideal to try to emulate, become for self-improvement. Yeah, so he was definitely good about like understanding that you can become something new, and that was like one of his big, like, you know, it was a good idea. But I mean, I come at it from like the sort of philosophical perspective, like what do we get out of him now? And there's still a lot to get out of him now, but as far as I'm concerned, his technical debt to some of the other thinkers never was overcome. So yeah. And so even though he did some really interesting stuff, like I just don't there's not a whole lot there that I can like dig my teeth into. All right, where was I? Okay. But I also remember some bad stuff, like he said, like he also said, was taken badly by bad people. Yeah, I mean, he was taken badly, and his sister edited his books and made him sound worse than he was at times. So, like, he was less racist probably than his early notebooks showed up as, because his sister was racist and anti-Semitic, and she made him sound worse than he actually probably was. He probably didn't like the Jewish religion, but I don't think he liked the Christian religion, but like he saw that as like the old way of thinking, but it wasn't like particularly because he didn't like Jews. He didn't like Chinese. Like he would mention the Jews and the Chinese in like the same sentence, and no one actually thought he was like anti-Chinese. It was just examples of like historical things. And so it's like, well, if you cross out the Chinese and he keeps hammering on the Jews, then it makes him sound like he don't like the Jews. But if he was always talking about the Jews and the Chinese and like some other historical people, then it was more of just like a trope. He was using people as like historical things. Yeah, so it's like, but you know, a lot of these older folks from previous centuries had bad ideas, and you know, some of the people knew better, some of them just were going along. It's hard to like disentangle everything, but he was not a social Darwinist. Yeah, they want to pin him on it. He had his own ideas. He did not like Darwinism, actually. He didn't like the idea that there was evolution would take the choice out of your hands. So he did not like that at all. He didn't like like for all the same reasons he didn't like social Darwinism. He actually hated Darwinism. You'd think he would like it, but he didn't like the idea of there being something outside of the person's agency that would be doing anything like that. And so he didn't like any of those things, actually. Like, that's just wrong. Which I know, but people like to pin social Darwinism on him, but that's not what he was saying. It was more, you know, the will to power is not social will to power. It was a person's will to power. So, or you might say society is doing this, but that didn't apply to social Darwinism. Like that would be the exact wrong thing. And he knew, like, Charles Darwin had written the book. People were talking about this stuff, so he had heard about it, and I'm pretty sure there's a quote somewhere where he says he hates Darwin. It's like, for this reason. It's like, it completely misses the point of Nietzsche if you think he's like a Darwinian. Because that puts the power into nature's hands. It takes it away from you. Okay. Alright, so what is nihilistic? Yeah. Oh, thank you, DeMarshall. What is nihilistic in Nietzsche's articulation of the meaning of being in both its what and its that character? Is erasure of the phenomena of truth. Yeah, this is the ground again, like what is because if you're just spinning, there's no ground. Precisely for the sake of maintaining the concept of truth as correctness. For the permanentizing of becoming must of course be falsification, but becoming is precisely not being understood as permanence. No proposition can ever, as it were, catch entities and hold them fast, so be true of them. Truth is error. Yeah, so if you're always spinning, you're never going to catch anything. You're just always spinning your own wheel, and this truth of correctness, you can never apply anything to the world if you're always like in the sort of like eternal recurring state, because you're never anywhere to begin with. Of course, Heidegger could have said, as others have, that Nietzsche was just wrong about that. Instead, he proposes that Nietzsche's paradoxical formula was never intended as a theory of truth or any kind of conventionally understood metaphysical doctrine. Rather, it expresses and embodies a profound recognition of something happening in the culture, namely the forgetting of being and the disappearance of truth, understood not as correctness or accuracy, but as unconcealment. This is why Heidegger insists that we have missed the significance of Nietzsche's thinking if we simply imagine him as the eccentric professor who invented the theories of will to power and eternal recurrence. It is rather that the will to power itself really is stamping becoming with the character of being, thus reducing the truth of entities to an inescapable falseness. Will to power itself, Heidegger says, the fundamental character of entities as such, and not Herr Nietzsche, posits the idea of an eternal recurrence of the same. Again, Nietzsche is not himself simply a purveyor of metaphysical doctrines. He is instead the sounding board through whom nihilism is manifesting itself in our technological culture. So if you're trying to find any one thing, the truth as correctness, it's not going to be the eternal return because that's everything. So if you're thinking of everything, you can't actually pin down anything that you're lining anything else up to. So that's kind of what I think is going on right here. But I mean, it looks kind of like Heidegger is trying to, make hay with Nietzsche. It's like he's saying, well, look, everyone else has got it wrong and I've got it right. So this is one of these strategies. You take the famous person's name and says, look, I've got it right. I've got the real thing going on here. So I don't know if this is accurate or just Heidegger, trying to say, look, you all got Nietzsche wrong. You come listen to me. I got Nietzsche right. Even though, frankly, who knows if Heidegger is just projecting at this point, just to say, well, this is really what Nietzsche meant, and I understand. You should listen to me. Finally, in the 1953 essay, Who is Nietzsche, Zarathustra?, Heidegger poses the rhetorical question whether inquiring beyond Nietzsche's thinking can be a continuation of his thought, or whether it must become a step back. To step back in thought is to take up the kind of commemorative thinking expressed in Hölderlin's poem Remembrance, presumably, though Heidegger doesn't say so here, as an alternative to Nietzsche's rhapsodizing about what he calls philosophers of the future. Again, the will to power stamps the character of being onto entities. Heidegger asks, does such thinking overcome prior reflection, overcome the spirit of revenge? Or does there not lie concealed in this very stamping a form of ill will against sheer transiency and thereby a highly spiritualized spirit of revenge? I mean, what do you mean? I'm always a little confused about this stamp metaphor. But I mean, it's basically saying, look, you're saying will to power as a sort of constant recurrence of onto itself. That's what all entities are. And does this overcome reflection of the spirit of revenge, or does not lie concealed in this very stamping? In the process of putting the version of this will to power onto things, haven't you just done the same thing that has always been in the past, giving everything a form? So, yeah. Heidegger is here very obviously, indeed a bit clumsily, trying to turn Nietzsche's own critical diagnostic weapons against him. Yeah. Eternal recurrence is itself a metaphysical expression of hostility, a falsification of the truth of entities as such. It might sound like a somewhat glib, too coquet. I always forget how to say too coquet, I'm going to say. But again, Heidegger's point is not to refute Nietzsche, but to show that he belonged far more than he realized to the tradition from which he was trying to free himself. Zarathustra's doctrine does not bring redemption from revenge. We do say it. Yet we say it by no means as a misconceived refutation of Nietzsche's philosophy. We do not even utter it as an objection against Nietzsche's thinking. But we say it in order to turn our attention to the fact that, an extent to which, Nietzsche's thought, too, is animated by the spirit of prior reflection. More poignantly, something in Nietzsche's thinking comes to the fore which this thinking itself was no longer able to think. The idea of eternal recurrence, which Nietzsche himself called the most abysmal thought, Heidegger says, conceals something unthought, something which at the same time remains a closed door to metaphysical thinking. Why? Okay, so what is the eternal recurrence hiding? Time is it? Okay. Overcoming metaphysics. And I guess this would be Hadagarian, what Heidegger wants to do here. The real transformation that occurred in Heidegger's thinking leading up to the outbreak of the war, I believe, lay not particularly in his reading of Nietzsche, but more generally in his reassessment of the nature and history of metaphysics. So this is like the big payoff in this essay. We're going to find out kind of what the turn was right at this time through this reading here. Because this is actually a thing in like Heidegger scholarship, like what turned in his thought. So we're actually getting a somewhat like preliminary answer via this route of looking at Nietzsche. So this is the payoff, like if you're a Heidegger scholar here. Prior to 36, Heidegger used the term freely with no pejorative connotation. The first sentence of Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics, for instance, credits Kant with placing the problem of metaphysics before us as a fundamental ontology, which he in turn defines as the metaphysics of human existence, Dasein, required for metaphysics to be made possible. Similarly, his famous 1929 inaugural lecture, What is Metaphysics?, addresses that question not by examining and discussing metaphysics at arm's length, as it were, but by taking up a particular metaphysical question, thereby letting ourselves be transposed directly into metaphysics. Heidegger's lectures of 1929 to 30 are entitled The Fundamental Concepts of Metaphysics, metaphysics being, as he explained at the outset, the central discipline in the whole of philosophy. Even as late as 1935, far from excluding the pre-Socratics at one end of the tradition and himself at the other, Heidegger says metaphysics just means philosophy. As I mentioned in the passing above, Heidegger's disavowal of the word metaphysics was at least in part a rhetorical response to Rudolf Carnap's 1931 essay, Elimination of Metaphysics through a Logical Analysis of Language, which ridiculed the question of being as a prime example of nonsense in violation of the rules of logical syntax. Heidegger insisted on the contrary that Vienna Circle positivists like Carnap were the real metaphysicians, for it was they who had reduced the question of being to mere gibberish by arbitrarily restricting meaning to the formal constraints of logic and mathematics and to the empirical constraints of scientific inquiry. Not surprisingly, Heidegger expressed particular contempt for Carnap's 1931 paper, What is Going On Here?, when he wrote in a first draft of Introduction to Metaphysics, is the uttermost reduction and deracination of the traditional theory of judgment under the illusion of mathematical scientificity. That's actually not bad. I haven't seen scientificity before. Yeah, so I'm not surprised Heidegger hated Carnap's sort of logical approach to everything. Because, I mean, the positivists, there's not too many positivists around. They didn't last. So, yeah. Of course, in redefining the term metaphysics, Heidegger was also beginning to distance himself from Nietzsche and Nietzsche's doctrines of will to power and eternal recurrence, in effect retreating from the charged blend of political and philosophical rhetoric with which he had been supporting the Nazi regime, not only during his year as rector of Freiburg University in 33 to 34, but for several years thereafter. Exactly how long is a matter of continuing controversy. Yeah, he was a Nazi. He stayed for a while. The exchange in Heidegger's conception of metaphysics was both terminological and substantive. Terminologically, the word took on a different meaning in his vocabulary before and after roughly 1936. Substantively, Heidegger came to see his own project as more radically discontinuous with the tradition and began distinguishing his own thinking more sharply from metaphysics in the later, narrower sense of the word. Earlier, he argued that Western philosophy as a whole, including the pre-Socratics, had failed to make the question of being fully thematic. By 1939, he was insisting that the particular manner or style of thinking that began with Plato and ended with Nietzsche was always and remained systematically incapable of even acknowledging, let alone addressing, the question. Nietzsche, Heidegger concluded, remained trapped in that tradition. He could not show us the way out of it. Okay, so this just ends up with basically he thought metaphysics was like this grand project, he got it done, and then he came to realize that basically by stamping everything in the world with trying to like stamp the being on it to understand the being, that is just all more of the same, and you're not getting out of it. Okay, so we're not getting the substantive what Heidegger later thought, which is fine, you're not going to do it. Because that's kind of hard to put that in this essay to begin with, but at least you can see from the Nietzschean analysis that where Heidegger would say, look, The metaphysical problem is that you're still stamping everything with eternal recurrence, but that's exactly like you're stamping everything with the form of being back in Plato. Form of being. It's just eternal recurrence now, but that doesn't change anything. You're just changing some words around. And so that is exactly where the criticism is coming in. You have not gotten past Plato if you're doing the same process over and over again. And that's what the kind of the process way is here. So even though Heidegger is saying Nietzsche at least saw the whole history, he was still doing the same thing, even though it was on the whole history of Western thought, and so therefore did not escape it, even though he was doing it, instead of just doing it in like for different concepts and ideas, he did it on the whole history of it. That doesn't get you out of the problems of the history. It just sort of gets you to the end of it, as it were. Okie dokie. So does anyone have any questions about this? Please let me know. I am, like I've said, I've read a little bit of Heidegger. I'm not an expert. Same with Nietzsche. Not an expert. Know a little bit. So I don't have a whole lot in terms of history to argue about. Try to explain what I think the turn was here. That in looking at the whole history of Western philosophy and stamping it, like, and sort of looking at the being in terms of eternal recurrence, it's still giving a form to that being. And then if you want to know what Heidegger's later thought was, how to get out of that, then you can go read some more Heidegger. Yep. So, it's been a fun night for me. Read 2 papers. Hope you guys had a good time too. Don't know if I learned anything. You never know if you learn anything with philosophy, but it seemed fun. I don't know why people love talking about Heidegger. What's so special about his phenomenology, and that's it. His phenomenology is fantastic. You're not going to get... It's a lot of fun. Once you understand what's going on, it's like, it's a little crazy. It's good times. It's very hard to explain, though. You have to put some time and effort in. And so, like, and once you're in it, it's like, it's great. It's like, it's a lot of fun. But, like, the problem is, it's... It takes a bunch of effort to understand that he's really looking at stuff in a kind of a different way than other people. But yeah, it's like, I just can't tell you. It's like you tell people things like, well, context is very important. Yeah, that does nothing for anybody if you tell people context is very important. Like, how do you see the tree separate from, like, its context? Like, that doesn't mean anything. It's like, well, the trees. It just sounds, like, laughable. But once you understand a little bit more about, like, what's going on and you take, like, a look at things from, you sort of have to rearrange how you're putting things in the world, where the sociology professor was obsessed with the phenomenology. It was a fun class. Yeah, it's like a fun thing to talk about too. Once like you get to like discuss it, but it's just not gonna. There's no like telling somebody how to view the world. Like you have to like sort of give them enough background and then say, well, if you start looking at it this way, then eventually it clicks for people. But it's not so easy. But that's the part of it, is that like it kind of has to click. So. It's like if I ask you to like see like what was I like? It's like seeing So what's it called? Where's my duck rabbit? So here's a duck rabbit. It's like trying to ask someone to see the duck and then see the rabbit. Is this kind of what the phenomenology is like? How do you actually go about getting someone to see the duck and the rabbit? You can tell them. Nice, Bubba Bloop. You can tell them to do it, but like it's kind of like that's sort of the problem. You can't make someone see the world in a certain way, and that's part of the thing about phenomenology. So once people really see it, it's like, well, you get to like see the whole, like you get to see the duck instead of seeing the rabbit. And it's like really cool, and people get all up about that. Have you heard of Peter Berger and the common stock of knowledge? I do not know what that is. I mean, do I have to buy stock to have knowledge? Like, is it like a GameStop? And like, is it like boom and bust? That'd be kind of fun. You know what? Let me tell you something. You really don't need it, DeMarshall. It's fun, but like it's completely unnecessary. And there's a question of how far it really gets you. sociology stuff that was really similar to phenomenology. Oh, interesting. Okay, so I don't know. Yeah, so maybe some the other group like had done similar stuff. That's interesting. That like the sociologists had their own like way of doing it. Yeah. No one needs Heidegger. You just don't. It's a lot of fun, but I don't think anyone needs him at this point. I mean, of course, I'm sure some Heidegger scholars disagree. I'm sure the author, if they are watching this review, they'd be like, "No, you need Heidegger. You have to understand Heidegger." Yeah, sure you do, but like, there's always more than one way to do stuff. Okay, I just hate phenomenal stuff because it's complex and new. Yeah, it ain't easy. And that's fair. Like, it is complex. It is kind of new. Kind of. Like, there's ways to look at, like, the history that they may have been doing stuff somewhat similar to it. But, yeah, again, it's different enough in the current times that it's, like, kind of, like, complex and new. Yeah, so what was fun here is I didn't know about this. Yeah. Existential stuff is fun too. This is an interest. I hadn't really thought about this. I didn't know about it. That Heidegger was interpreting the eternal recurrence of the world, not as that the world was like always recurring the same way, but that we were always stuck in between the history, the infinite history and infinite future, and that's where we were always stuck. It was an eternal recurrence of the now, because it's always now, and so it's like you never can get anywhere and do anything. So it's like even though you're sort of willing to power, you're always stuck in a privileged now. So that's I hadn't heard this interpretation of Nietzsche before, this Heideggerian interpretation of the eternal recurrence. So this is a cool thing here. So it's not that of a smooth continuous circle, and hence is a privileged now. Instead, he imagines the present dwarfed as unique gateway controlled moment line smack in the middle of a true eternity is not one. The two eternities are not merely distinct. He says that they are but. So like you're stuck in between these two things that are colliding at every point. And so everything goes, everything returns. Wheel of existence, the animals are not incorrect. But yeah, like they've made thinking you're always in this eternal recurrence as you made a joke of like your stuckness in the middle of history. So could be just tone and effect, but why is the gateway important? Why do you start with the gateway? Well, you need this is the interesting part. Like you start with the important things in philosophy, and if your two paths lead endlessly in different directions, but you're always stuck between these two paths, what is like the like that eternal stuckness there? How do you get out of that? And that's kind of the issue here. So this would visit emphasis on the present moment and inadequate finite representation of the infinity of time properly conceived as an undifferentiated and unending cycle. Yeah, so you're always stuck in this spot, but the spot is not a loop in the sense of your loop of history. It's a loop that you can't get out of the two infinities of past and future. Okay, I think that's right. Well, I thought you did English, Bubba Bloop. Didn't you do English, Bubba Bloop? You're the English major, Bubba Bloop. No, sociology. Just everyone thinks he was. Okay, so if you guys don't have any more questions, that'll be it for now, I guess. I had fun, so hope you guys had a good time. But yeah, that's it. So thank you all for being here, and I hope to be back sooner rather than later. It's just times have been busy and complicated, so thank you to Marshall. And that'll be it. Thank you, and everyone go hang out with Bubba Bloop later tonight. I actually have socials. Yeah, it's fine. You caught the second one. So, like, I do have a Discord now. I just mostly been discussing Minesweeper. But like, yeah, today I announced that I was streaming later, and also there's the YouTube where a lot of these videos get uploaded eventually when I get around to it. So, If you are so interested, there they are. And thank you all. Stay safe and have a great day, great night, and all of that. Bye-bye.